Before we start this week's show, I'd like to remind you that the Brazilian Report is funded by subscriptions and support from loyal readers. Besides subscribing to our website and getting exclusive content on Brazil and Latin America, you can also treat our staff to 1 to 5 cups of coffee a month. In return, you get exclusive benefits like special newsletters, behind-the-scenes content, as well as a shout-out here on our podcast. Today, I want to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members, Mark Hillary, John Thomas III, Luis Hans, Erwin Menes, Orlando Black, Steve Knapp, Aaron Berger, James Coney, Kars Vresvik, Alasdair Townsend, Peter Abrahamson, Michael Fryer, Miller Renascido, Dima Wolfadejo, David Dixon, Felipe Saito, José Rose Stankovic, Gabriela Graf Innes, Emerging Market Muser, Yarden Iftar, Tonica Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Fra, Peter Suffering, Anna Lund, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. If you also believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, head over to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of the membership tiers. If you cannot make a monthly commitment, you can still tip us a cup of coffee every now and then to give us the energy we need to cover a country as complex as Brazil and a region as complex as Latin America. We appreciate all your support. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. The rise of social media has revolutionized how people communicate and consume information, but it has also brought challenges such as the spread of misinformation and hate speech. Multiple countries are beginning to consider the idea of regulating social media to address these issues, and Brazil is one of them. However, regulating social media can also lead to concerns about censorship and the infringement of free speech rights. A working group created by the Lula administration will have to thread that needle. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. Following the January 8th Brasília riots, the Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva administration last week created a working group to present strategies and policy solutions to fight extremist acts and hate speech online. The group will operate under the Human Rights Ministry, and its first task will be understanding how hate speech spreads on social networks. Speech preaching hate, fascism, and Nazism, Human Rights Minister Silvio Almeida said, do not belong in a democracy. They have to be strongly fought before getting to people, he stated. Most of the group's 29 participants have been on the receiving end of social media vitriol, particularly from supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro.
A protest with similarities to the January 6th insurrection in Washington is currently underway in South America.
Breaking situation in Brazil. Thousands of supporters of ousted former President Bolsonaro storming the presidential and congressional buildings, demanding he be restored to power.
They took selfies, ransacked offices, and roamed the halls of Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential offices.
The committee will be chaired by Manuela Dávila, who in 2018 was the vice presidential nominee on the ticket headed by Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad, Lula's understudy, and his current finance minister. Mrs. Dávila has also received threats, some targeting her 6-year-old daughter. To discuss the committee and Brazil's tall challenge to regulate social media, we invited Guilherme Casarões, who will be part of the group. Guilherme is a professor at think tank Fundação Getúlio Vargas and co-founder of the Observatory of the Far Right. Guilherme, welcome back to the show. And to start off our conversation, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the working group to curb hate speech online. How were you approached, and what are your tasks that are being laid out?
Well, thank you for having me once again. It's a group that was convened a couple of weeks ago, after, of course, the January 8th events. I was approached by the Minister of Human Rights, Silvio Almeida himself, who called me and asked me if I wanted to join this working group. We still do not have a lot of information about how it's going to work, whether sessions are going to be virtual or in person in Brasília. So all I can say for now is that the main point, especially after January 8th, is to think about strategies to curb hate speech, left and right extremism, and most of all, to think about strategies for reconciling the country. I think that's the most important task of the Lula administration overall. Of course, there are some other very meaningful things Lula has vowed to do during the campaign, such as reducing poverty and inequality. But in the context of a deeply radicalized country, I think it's also important to think about how to rebuild the common ground for Brazilians to feel that they are part of the same society. You know, I think that's the most important thing, and that's the main reason why this group was formed. Even though we don't have the details, we have a good idea of what daunting tasks we have ahead of us in terms of thinking about strategies for containing further extremism, and of course, thinking about government-sponsored policies to make sure that Brazil will very soon see itself as one again.
I mean, daunting tasks there are indeed. You were one of the founders of the Observatory of the Far Right, which, among other things, monitor online extremism. It seems as if multiple countries are starting to tackle the issue of misinformation and online hate speech. Is there anything specific about Brazil's struggle with these issues, or is Brazil facing problems that are similar to those being seen in the US or in the rest of Latin America or Europe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are a lot of common problems. Brazil and some other countries in the world have been facing in recent years, especially with the rise of social media and a new form of political communication overall. I think these are challenges many countries are having to face up front. The Brazilian case in particular, I'd say that it has a few peculiarities. The first one is, unlike other countries where these political movements have developed and surfaced through social media, but they have remained out of power, in Brazil's case, as much as in the United States case, probably, the government has actively sponsored disinformation and fake news, building a government-led structure of lying to the public and building narratives that somehow have helped radicalize the country. So I think that the former administration, the Bolsonaro administration, was very much aware that fake news was an integral part of its governing capacity and its governing strategy. And that's the reason why, from early in Bolsonaro's presidential campaign, as early as 2016 or 17, all the way through the end of his administration, there has been a lot of social media use to spread disinformation and to blatantly lie to people. Um, and of course, the underlying strategy behind it is we need to build narratives based on lies, based on distorted notions of history and of politics, because we need to fuel hate and we need to fuel a resentment among Brazilians. So that's pretty much what they have done. And there's a fundamental difference between Brazil and the United States in this regard, because the fake news and disinformation structures in the United States have been around for much longer. And when Trump came around in 2015, 2016, he benefited from a structure that was pretty much already in place. If you think about the alt-right in the United States, for example, which is a movement that dates back to the early 2000s. So Trump was just a beneficiary of all that. In Brazil's case, though, Bolsonaro was both a beneficiary and an active participant and creator of this movement since he decided to run for president, I don't know, 2015 or 2014. So I think that that makes the Brazilian case very unique, because politics has become infused with these strategies. And I even developed an academic thesis about it, which is the Americanization of Brazilian politics. Somehow, Bolsonaro has been able to warp Brazilian politics to fit into the American culture wars. So the language, the conspiracy theories, the strategies, they've been mimicking the American culture war for most of it. Over the last couple of years. So I think that Brazil is peculiar because of that. And of course, if we consider other elements such as religion, such as the role of the military as active players in this misinformation / fake news structures, I think that Brazil provides a very challenging, but also very complete case study for other countries to analyze if they want to fight this kind of radicalization online. And there's something else I would say, which if you look at the trajectory of the Bolsonaro administration, it becomes very, very clear. The Brazilian case is also challenging because the way conspiracies have been put together, the way conspiracies have worked, it provided for a major challenge for Brazil's democracy, because the main element, the main aspect, besides of course fueling hate and resentment, was to challenge Brazil's political institutions. Somehow, if you compare the Brazilian experience to the United States, for example, in the United States, there seems to have been, of course, a lot of conspiracy theories going around regarding the deep state and all that. But there was a sense of preserving the U.S. democratic institutions. And in the case of Brazil, maybe thanks to our military dictatorship past, which is very recent, by the way, thanks to Bolsonaro's militaristic and radicalized rhetoric, I think that most of these structures of fake news were directed at Brazil's democratic institutions. So another thing that other countries might want to study about Brazil is how the Supreme Court has responded to these challenges. Very controversial decisions have been made, of course, if you think about Alexandre de Moraes, for example. But I'd say that this is also something that we have to analyze, both in the working group, but also as an international case study. I mean, how the Supreme Court has struggled to preserve democracy in a very hostile environment.
At UNESCO's recent Internet for Trust conference, Brazil supported a global effort to regulate social media platforms and, quote, correct the distortions of a business model that generates profit through the exploitation of users' personal data. Doesn't it seem, though, like a tall order to aspire a sort of global regulatory effort on online speech? I mean, is that even realistic?
Well, I think that what's realistic about it is to think of a framework for national discussions around fake news and online disinformation structures. So I think this is one thing. Of course, UNESCO, as part of the United Nations family, it has a very powerful recommendatory power, right? So it can, as I said before, provide a framework for further discussions about it, both on regional and on national levels. But it's very hard to enforce, of course. If you think about a worldwide regulation of online speech, that's very hard to attain, not only because I don't think there would be consensus around it, but also because countries have already begun dealing with it on a national level with their own specific legislations. And I think this is even a bigger issue than just online hate speech. If you think about the regulatory discussions around privacy, data usage, uh, freedom of speech that we see in Europe and the United States and in some non-Western countries like India, uh, these are all very different from each other. So again, I think UNESCO's efforts are very important in terms of establishing some, laying the groundwork, establishing some common ideas around which something can be built on a national level, but it would be too utopian, I'd say, to think of a global regulatory framework at this point.
Guilherme, the Supreme Court in the US is looking at cases that could completely alter social media and internet regulations. But the court has a conservative majority. If the US Supreme Court adopts a hands-off approach, can we in Brazil do something about it, considering that most social media companies are based in the US?
I think that we have two problems there. The first one is most countries, especially Western countries, they look up to the United States as a source of legitimacy to whatever they're doing nationally. So we've seen this happen in Brazil, for example, over the last 4 years. I mean, most of Bolsonaro's narratives and even some of his policy decisions have been legitimized by a comparison with the United States. So in a way, if they adopt a hands-off approach there, we might have people crying out for a hands-off approach here, completely disregarding the fundamental principle and legal differences that we have between both countries. We know that the United States is a country where freedom of speech is sacred. In many ways, it's very hard to think of censorship of any kind in the American legal framework, because freedom of speech is so important. If you think about the First Amendment, for example, which goes beyond freedom of speech, of course, but the very idea of people being able to speak their mind and say whatever they want, even if it's hate speech, is a typically American thing. It has no resonance with the Brazilian legislation, for example. We are much more strict in terms of fighting and punishing hate speech. And one of the discussions that we've seen over the last years has been about like previous censorship over attempts of overthrowing democracy, for example. So I think that it might complicate things a little bit in terms of legislators in Brazil looking up to the United States and saying, okay, we have to follow the same path. But I think that the broader public is aware that the logic of freedom of speech in Brazil is very different. Not to mention other countries, of course. But in the case of Brazil in particular, I think it might affect, but not too much. Now, when it comes to the role of the big techs, one of the efforts of many countries, including Brazil, is to nationalize their policies, their terms, right? So I don't think that would be a problem either, because if the United States Supreme Court decides it's up to the big tech companies to decide what's right and what's wrong, yet the Brazilian legal framework would not allow big techs to adopt rules that differ that much from what's considered a crime or not to the eyes of the Brazilian legislation. So I think that most big techs will have to adapt to national realities, which are fundamentally different from the ones that they have in the United States. And of course, since big techs are driven obviously by profit, I don't think that would be a problem. If you think about big countries like India and Brazil that have millions, maybe hundreds of millions of users of these platforms, I don't think big techs will take the risk of being shut down in countries like that because they do not follow the law, just because they think that their own standards of freedom of speech is the right one to follow.
Brazil already has a legal framework for the internet, passed in 2014. So that is very recent, especially if we compare to the US's Section 230, which was enacted in 1996. How can the law keep up with rapidly changing technology? Because we saw during the 2022 election that moderating content online is like playing a really, really hard game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the fact that our Marco Civil or civil framework is recent reflects different paces of the internet usage and evolution in Brazil. I mean, Brazil lagged behind in several respects when it comes to the use of social media, for example, and legislators were probably busy with other things, and that's why it took them a long time to think about a common ground for internet use in Brazil. But I think that this is a bigger challenge. It's not just about Brazil or the United States or any other country for that matter. I think that technology poses challenges to the law every single day. With the rise of artificial intelligence, for example. I mean, it's not just the law, really. If you think about it, I'm a university professor. We face challenges, including regulatory challenges regarding artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and everything else that's coming around on a daily basis. So I think that maybe one of the problems that we're going to face in Brazil in particular is that we have a very divided Congress right now. And therefore, that's probably going to make a consensus around new technologies emerging and challenging the law virtually impossible, especially now that we have a very conservative group in Congress, which is probably more conservative than ever before. But yet, I think that this is a natural discussion for most democracies around the world. I mean, how to keep up with changes and challenges posed by technology, and I think that Brazil has a very avant-garde legislation regarding internet use. So I think this is a challenge for pretty much every single democracy out there to keep up with the challenges and the changes of technology. But in the case of Brazil, I think that we have a very avant-garde legislation when it comes to internet use. And therefore, if we combine the precedents opened by the Brazilian Supreme Court regarding elections, electoral rules, and fake news legislation on the one hand, and our existing legislation on the other, I think that we might get to some very good results.
You mentioned at the beginning of their conversation that the idea of the working group on hate speech came in the aftermath of the January the 8th Brasília riots. Now, when there are attempts to act following a traumatic event like that, isn't there a huge risk of overcorrecting the problem?
Well, I understand your question, but I don't think that's the case because the idea of fighting hate speech came well before the January 8th attacks. I mean, this is something that many people, including myself, have been discussing on an academic level and on a policy level. So, and this is also something that the Brazilian Congress has also attempted to address before. So I don't really think that we have been summoned because of January 8th. Of course, it sort of accelerates the process in the sense that after what we saw, after this upfront attack against Brazil's democracy, it seemed clear that this kind of discussion cannot wait because, of course, some people might just come around and try to overthrow Brazil's democracy once again. We know that there are political problems within the Lula administration when it comes to the relationship with the military, for example, and the relationship with some security forces on the state level. So the working group, as I understand it, and as I said, I have no specific information about how it's going to work yet, but I don't think that the working group will be attached to the events of January 8th, especially because there are many investigations, ongoing investigations on January 8th, and they are completely disconnected from our long-term task, which is to fight hate speech whenever and whatever it takes place. So I fear no risk of overcorrecting in this regard. First of all, because it's just a working group. We have no policy power. The minister does, of course, but we have only the power of discussing and suggesting strategies, pathways, and solutions for that. And I think it's a long-term task. I've been saying this in some other interviews. I don't think that Brazil will be able to get back to its feet in terms of social or societal unity in the next 4 years. This is a task for a generation, and of course, as for me, I would love to keep helping Brazil fight hate and reconcile. But we understand that this is not something that we will be able to achieve in a matter of a few weeks or a few meetings. So I think that we are very conscious. I've spoken to some of the other members of the working group, and I think that we are very conscious all together that this is a very slow-moving process, and it has to be very carefully thought, because if policies emerge from this working group, these have to be policies for the Brazilian democracy, not policies for one government or another.
Prior to setting up the working group you are a part of, the new government had created 2 departments to purposely fight disinformation. But some, notably on the right, fear that the solution may just create new problems. They remember Lula's first spell in office, during which the government submitted a bill proposing the creation of a federal journalism council, which would be a body similar to those regulating physicians and lawyers. And per the proposal, journalists that violated the organization's principles could have been banned from working. Now, the bill was lambasted by mass media at the time, and it was voted down on the House floor. In 2004, Lula also ordered the revocation of a New York Times journalist's visa after he wrote that allies of the then president were concerned by his drinking habits. The move was, of course, unsurprisingly met with backlash, and that forced Lula to backtrack. So I'm citing these examples because they are being used by conservatives to say that the Workers' Party is not a good actor to propose speech regulation. Now, my question is any political party a good actor to police speech? And in a country as polarized as current Brazil, how can government policies on the issue be seen as legitimate by people on both sides of the aisle?
Well, I think that the Workers' Party's proposals for media control are very often misrepresented by opponents in general. I remember the discussions back in 2003 or 2004 when Lula and Franklin Martins, if I'm not mistaken, were mostly speaking of business monopoly issues. So their fight against corporate media was an economic one, not an ideological one, as far as I can remember. Of course, there was the episode involving New York Times correspondent Larry Rotter. But I think that all in all, if you look at the Workers' Party track record, it has been always very even docile with corporate media after these backlashes from Lula's early times in office. So I think that there's no one who has the moral authority or legitimacy to police speech. I think that speech can only be fought legally on legal grounds. And it's not up to the government to make these decisions, because if it's about legislation, then it's up to the Supreme Court and to Congress to come up with legislations. Of course, the government can propose legislation, it can suggest paths and all, but I'd say that the crux of the matter is if anything is to be done regarding hate speech and extremism, it has to be an all-encompassing alliance where civil society, academics, journalists, business people, activists of all kinds, and political parties will join the front of discussion. So this discussion does not belong to one party or another. And Silvio Almeida, for example, who's the Minister of Human Rights, he's not your typical Workers' Party member, politician, right? Most people who are in this working group are either academics or activists with no party affiliation. So I think that, well, first of all, the main goal of the working group is not to police speech to begin with. But I'd say that the whole point there is we are going through a situation where radicalization is a problem for society and is a problem for democracy. And it has to be fought with policy and with the law. We have to think about this for long term. We have to think about long-term solutions for that. And if the president happens to be a Workers' Party president, that's fine. I would be doing this under any other pro-democracy government, to be sure. So I don't think this discussion is a partisan one, and it cannot be framed as partisan. Otherwise, people will just, be chasing their own tail and unable to really look into the future and think about the future challenges that we have before the Brazilian society.
Guilherme, before I let you go, is there any international benchmark from which Brazil could borrow?
I don't think there is a framework that might just, serve Brazil's needs as of now, because the European legislation, the European framework is very unique and is very particular to European needs that have been around for decades now. And even within Europe, we see heated discussions about the validity or the legitimacy of a European Union-wide legislation for freedom of speech or social media use. And I don't think the United States framework is good either, because they have very different philosophical positions on freedom of speech, especially among the conservatives, which does not suit Brazilian needs either. So I think that what we have to look into is the precedents established by the Bolsonaro administration, the Supreme Court decisions on electoral rules, and we have to improve them, right? And of course, to do away with whatever didn't work, whatever has actually damaged the discussion more than healed it. So I think that we have to analyze everything that happened over the last 4 years when it comes to political communication and disinformation structures, to learn from them and to, of course, prevent that these things happen again. Even though I understand, and as you've just said as well, it's an uphill battle, right? It's very hard to find disinformation in a deeply unregulated environment such as the internet. So even if it's not in the surface, sometimes it's out there in the deep. So I don't know. I'd say that we have to come up with our own solutions. There might be good examples here and there of specific measures that have been taken to fight, for example, WhatsApp use for spreading fake news. I know that India has had some interesting experiments regarding discussion between the government and big techs, but it's still in its infancy. So I think that for what it's worth, I think that Brazil has to look inward and learn from its own challenges and mistakes that have been made recently.
Guilherme Casadões, thank you very much for talking to us again. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Guilherme Casadões is a professor at think tank Fundação Getúlio Vargas and co-founder of the Observatory of the Far Right. If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second, and that really helps us reach a broader audience. Or better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism. Thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively, and for our work, we have won or been shortlisted for multiple journalism awards, the latest being the True Story Awards, which selected one of our articles as one of the world's best 94 articles written in 2022. In order to keep doing that work, we need your support. Just go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.